Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome everybody to the Caldwell County Heritage Museum this morning. I hope everybody's feeling well and prosperous today. Are we? Yeah. Very good, very good, very good. A little housekeeping detail or two first off. In the unlikely, emphasis unlikely case of an emergency, the fire exits are on the north side of the building, behind the galleries here, and of course the front entrance, and the doors on the south side of the building. We hope we will not have to use them, although our presenter, Mr. Groom, was already asking me about quick exits from the building. I told him there was no way out once you step up here. But at any rate, it's our pleasure and privilege this morning to have Dave Groom as our presenter. Dave's now a resident of Lenoir, long enough to be considered a hometown boy, I think. He studied furniture technology and industrial engineering at the University of Michigan, holds degrees from that institution. Also taught at the University of West Virginia and has worked in the furniture industry in various capacities now for almost 50 years, I believe he said that. Most recently with Bernhardt here in Caldwell County. He's now involved in private consulting in the furniture industry, and it's our pleasure to have him with us this morning. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Dave, and they're at your tender mercies.
Thank you, Jeff. A fellow about 2 months ago asked me if I'd do this, and I agreed I would. Then I understand he left town. That's the first thing that went wrong. I came down last Thursday and to get things all set up, and I found out Monday night that my presentation disappeared. And the heat was off in the building. And if things weren't bad enough there, I discovered it was the 13th of the month. So I guess you put it all together, hopefully things will go uphill from there. The presentation this morning is Wood in American Life, and it's a title I saw a few places. Of course, Planes, Trains, and Furniture. You've all heard of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, so I have to admit I copied that. But anyway, the point I'm going to make this morning is wood has been very important in forming America, dating back to the time the first settlers from Europe came and settled, and up until fairly recently, meaning the first several hundred years, virtually everything was made of wood. And a lot of people have trouble believing that, but the early settlers were on their own pretty much, and they made things out of wood. And we could say, well, why wood? Wood is first of all, most important, it's a totally renewable resource. And if you think of other things that we have, plastics and metals and so forth, they are not renewable. And wood is. You can always plant a tree. So if you're asked whether you want plastic or paper at the grocery store, you can grow another bag, you can't grow another plastic bag. So just, again, something to think about with wood. It grows in every warm continent in the world, which is a good feature. It's a very, very versatile raw material. We'll see that in a few minutes of the literally dozens and dozens and hundreds of things that have been made from wood. It can easily be molded into useful items of hand tools. And that's unlike most other raw materials we have to deal with that require machinery. With simple hand tools, you can make a whole lot of things that you need out of wood. I should say our forefathers could, and they did. There are over 70 commercial wood species in the United States. You probably haven't heard of all 70, but when I say commercial, at one time or another they've been cut from the forest and either sold or used by the person cutting them for an end product. Today we harvest perhaps 10 or 15 that are considered commercial for most of the uses we have. Wood varies in color, hardness, mechanical properties, and availability. And I might pass a few things around here. Here's two pieces of wood. One is black cherry, which grows all over a good part of North Carolina. Another is a tropical wood. What what I wanted to show you is the density difference. The tropical wood is very, very heavy compared to the black cherry, and also it has a very nice feature here called fiddleback, which you'll see when I pass it around. It's on one side and not the other, so it would be cut to take advantage of that. Fiddleback, you might be interested in where it gets its name, and the back of a fiddle is generally made of that wood, generally from maple. And a fiddleback in the back of a musical instrument has the advantage of dampening overtones. In other words, it makes the instrument sound better. So it's not just a coincidence to look pretty that instrument makers use it, but they use it for a real definite reason. But the density thing you can see, and that's just, and the color also, that's just two of the things that make wood unique.
Can everybody hear all right?
No.
We're working on it. We're gonna give you a mic, babe. I thought that stentorian voice of yours would stand alone.
Yeah, where'd the mouse go here? Okay. Okay, I'll try and talk a little louder so you can hear it maybe a little better. You can talk a little bit about wood structure. Not to get too technical, but wood is really composed of a bundle of fibers. And this can be thought very much like a bundle of soda straws. A good example of it. I've just taken a bunch of soda straws, cut them to length, and fastened them together. And that's what all wood looks like if you looked at it under a microscope. It's all pretty much the same. It's just that these fibers are different lengths, and they have different thicknesses in the wall of the fiber. And the thick wall makes that one piece of wood very heavy. The thin wall makes the wood very light. And that's basically the two differences. And then there are things called extractives, which are chemicals in the wood which give it color and also give it odor, such as red cedar. And I think you're all familiar with what a cedar chest smells like. Okay? Well, I can show that a little better with a slide. This is a slide showing what wood looks like under a microscope. And I've shown two different types of wood here. One, this is what white pine looks like, and this is the end. And here you're looking straight down into the straws that I mentioned before, the cells. And they're different sizes. Right here is a growth ring. And that you can see when you look at pine. And over here is what a typical piece of red oak looks like. Now the big cells, these ones right here, the ones with big diameter, the big straws, if you want to think of them that way, that's the early wood. That's what the tree grows in the springtime. And it's getting going, getting the leaves out and so forth. It grows great big cells. And then in the latter part of the year, it grows the smaller cells, and this is what gives a lot of strength to the wood. Now, I've got some examples of that, and one I want to show you. Somebody asked me one time, when you say that, you know, do those cells really do what you say they'll do? Well, this is a piece of red oak. And if I put soap on one end, you can see here, there's bubbles. And what I'm doing is I'm blowing air all the way through the piece of wood. And that just shows how open the cells are. And this is very important because, for example, if you attempted to make a barrel out of red oak and put something in it that was valuable, like say wine or whiskey, it's going to do what? It's going to leak. Okay? So this is important because our forefathers knew this, of course, but some made a mistake. And this next slide shows an example of that mistake. This is a sailing ship called the Mary Celeste. And this has been written up in a lot of places, including the internet and Wikipedia and so forth. And I understand somebody made a movie out of it. But the Mary Celeste was a sailing ship. It was two-masted, 103-foot length, 56-foot in beam being the width. It was built in 1861, rebuilt in 1872. And it was loaded with 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol. Now, back at that time, denatured alcohol was a very valuable solvent to use in industry to make things. So this wasn't to drink, this was strictly to use for industrial purposes. It departed New York City November 7, 1872, headed for Italy. And it had gone back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean several times, so this was no big deal. It was a small ship. It had the captain, his wife, his daughter, and a crew of 8 on board. And it was discovered adrift in the eastern part of the Atlantic Ocean. There's nothing wrong on the ship. Everything was intact. All the food, all the things on the ship were intact. The only thing missing was the crew, and they could not figure out what happened. The lifeboat was also missing. And this remained a mystery for quite a few years because they salvaged the ship and took it into port, but nobody could find anything wrong. And finally, someone concluded what was wrong, and this was just recently figured out. Out of those 1,700 barrels, 16 were made of red oak. And they're convinced that now what happened, those barrels leaked on board the ship. And the alcohol and the fumes of the alcohol built up in the hold of the ship. And the crew was afraid the ship was going to either explode or catch on fire. So they decided to all get into the lifeboat and tie the lifeboat to the ship and wait. And hopefully all this would be pumped out or leaked out or whatever. And during a storm or something, the lifeboat and the ship got separated because the line was trailing in the water when the ship was found. So this is a case where people were not paying attention to the species of wood, the correct wood being used for an application. So that tells you why it's important to always know the difference between red oak and white oak if you're going to make barrels or be a cooper. I mean, you know, I don't want to suggest anybody here might like to consume alcohol, but what they do with the red oak barrels, they char it, burn the inside, and then put a clear liquid in and let it age for several years. And it picks up the color, and from the charcoal in the barrel, it picks up the flavor. And that's what you pay for when you go to the store. So that's the difference. Okay, so much for sailing ships and all that. One of the things that's, I think interesting, has always been interesting to me, is this thing has a mind of its own, size of trees. Today, if we drive down the interstate, you see a lot of trees, but they're not very big. I mean, they're this big and this big and this big and this big and so forth. And we have to appreciate how big trees used to be. Now, this is an example of a very big tree. This is one of the sequoias growing out in California, the giant sequoia. You can see there are a couple individuals in the tree. There's one right there, there's one there, and there's one hanging right there. And what they're doing is they realized this tree had never been filmed, had never been photographed. And the National Geographic Society decided to put forth an effort and photograph it. So these men went up the tree, various heights, they took a series of photographs, and finally what they did is they put all the photographs together. And that's what the tree looks like. And you can see down below there's a fellow standing there, and there's also one up in the tree. It's just shy of 300 feet tall. It's estimated to be somewhere between 3,000 and 3,200 years old. And that makes the sequoias on our west coast the longest living thing on Earth. They've been there that long. Now think about that, 3,000 years. Think what's happened on Earth in 3,000 years. Across the base, it's approximately 36 feet in diameter. So they do grow quite big. And you think, well, that's great, you know, that's west coast. What do we have here? Well, here's one that was cut here. When I say here, this is an Appalachian white oak tree. And you can see from the fellows in it, it is roughly 13 feet in diameter. And this was cut in the early part of the last century. And just imagine cutting that tree down with an axe. I mean, they may spend 2 weeks cutting the tree down, one tree. And that gives you an idea how big they were. Now, this is in the Appalachian Mountains. This is what we used to have here. And that's a little bit of an idea of just, you know, how big they were. They weren't just here. Here's one out west. This is a redwood tree cut with a saw. And what they did, I don't think you can quite see it here, but the saw, there's 2 saws welded together in the middle to cut it down. And it must have taken an awful long time to do that. But that gives you an idea of the size of the tree. Here's another one. This is in the east. This is in the Appalachian Mountains. Another oak. Again, you can get an idea how the size of the tree. Another thing I always like to mention is a tree called the American chestnut. And this is, to me, one of the sad things that happened in American forestry, because the chestnut tree no longer exists, or it exists with people trying to bring it back. The chestnut tree was one of the most important trees in America up until the time the chestnut blight hit it. The chestnut blight was identified, the range incidentally, went all the way from southern Maine to northern Mississippi, coming down the mountain, and all the way west through Ohio to southern Michigan. So it had a tremendous range. It was the largest tree at the time. It normally ran 3 to 5 feet in diameter. It was 60 to 120 feet tall, which made it, in the woods, a big tree. You couldn't miss it. The blight came, they feel, from Asia. It was first identified in New York City in 1904. And from 1904, it started to spread westward. And by 1920, they think virtually every chestnut tree in the Appalachians had been infected with the chestnut blight. By 1940, all chestnut had been killed. The other thing that I thought was interesting, it's estimated, I think in 1920, I thought I had it up there, I don't, but they estimate the volume of chestnut lumber in the United States was 13 billion board feet. Now think of the lottery. Everybody's talking about $1 billion in the lottery. That's nothing compared to the size of the chestnut volume. It was a big, big volume tree, and it was the backbone, really, of wood in the United States when it was alive. The chestnut has all the advantages. It could be cut, it could be split easily, it burned very hot. From the bark and from the wood, we could get tannins to cure leather. It just had all the advantages you can think of. It was just a great wood to work with. So it was really sad that the blight got it and we lost it. So now, you can find one occasionally, you can find a little one, but the little one's probably going to get hit with the blight pretty quick. There are organizations around at the different universities that are trying to bring it back, and they're trying to cross it with other trees like the Japanese chestnut and some of the European chestnuts to see if they can create a chestnut tree that will be resistant to the blight. And so far, they haven't had any luck doing that. But there are some fairly big trees. The biggest stand of chestnuts, this is interesting, a soldier in the 1600s liked to eat chestnuts so well, he took a whole bunch of them back to North Dakota. And North Dakota had planted them. And North Dakota is so far out of the natural range of the chestnut that they grew and have done well. But, the thought is that sooner or later this blight is going to get to it and it's going to be a problem there. But they have grown rather big, and that is the thing, if you can just prevent the blight. Okay, if we look at the typical very early American home in the United States, 1760, 1780, and again, this is a little bit washed out, it's on the screen, but the biggest thing in the home, of course, is the fireplace. Fireplaces were very large. They were intended to burn sticks of wood that would be perhaps 2 feet, 3 feet, or even longer, unsplit, so you could pile them in there, and everything in the homes took place around the fireplace, whether it was social, whether it was cooking, whether it was eating the evening meal, regardless of what it was. So the fireplace is extremely important. And we have a number of things sitting around that are wood. We have a stool over here. A stool like that with 3 legs was probably made from a section out of a tree. Just cut it off, so it's round, and put 3 legs on it, and you have a stool, which is a good example of a very simple but useful early piece of furniture. There's also a chair here with a woven seat, but it's got turned legs on it. And I felt when I looked at this picture, it's a little bit out of place, because that would have had to have been made by a more professional cabinet maker to turn the legs and put a pattern on them. So the little stool is typical, the chair is not. And sitting around, of course, is pottery. Pottery was fired and by making making charcoal from wood and using potash from wood. This got the glaze in the pottery, and wood provided the heat to fire the pottery, and that's how it was done. But that's just an idea of what it was. There are little tools here. Some of them are on the case over here. Spoons, bowls, and so forth. All these being handmade and hand carved. Just an idea of some of the things, domestic. Virtually, as I indicated earlier, everything came from the forest and made from wood. Of course, we had the houses, barns, all the outbuildings, rafters, floors, roof, shingles. Again, all came from the forest around the house. Of the old houses built, most of them had dirt floors, which if they went to all this work to get all this wood product, it always surprises me they didn't do something to get a better floor than dirt, but that's generally what it ended up being. And of course, fencing, vehicles being carts and wagons, tools, inside, the bowls, spoons, dippers, everything. And of course, ultimately furniture, fuel for cooking, charcoal. I mentioned that for a couple things. Charcoal was used as medicine. It was used to brush teeth. It had a whole lot of applications. And of course, from the charcoal and the ashes came what was needed to make soap. And the ashes were often sold by an early homeowner because they were valuable to people making glass at this point in time. Make sure I got the right one. The other uses of wood, of course, this would be different parts of the, not the home, but around being built by the community. You can read them, bridges, ships, and masts. Masts were extremely important. In New England, very straight, long white pine trees were marked by the king, or by the king's people. Excuse me. These were straight and very valuable to use in the building of ships. And at that time, you were punishable by death if you chopped one of these trees down. And the local people thought this was just the British government putting another restriction on what they did. It kind of went along with the Tea Party, I think. But anyway, that didn't last very long, and nobody paid any attention to the king marking the trees, I understand. The others you can read: tools, medicine, dyes. Paper was a big one. Paper's an interesting one because you ask people today, how much paper do you think you use a year? And most people think, 10 pounds, 20 pounds. Right now, the consumption of paper in the United States is estimated to be between 800 and 900 pounds per person in the United States. Now, we think of paper often as what we write on, but the cartons of food comes in the grocery store, the Amazon carton you got the Christmas present in, these are all paper products and all very important. And also, it goes along with that, the average home today uses about 40 to 45 pounds of bathroom tissue. So if you think you're not dependent on forests, think again. Okay, roads were made of wood. They quickly discovered it was a great idea, and horses could pull a much greater load on a wooden road than they could on a dirt road, but they only lasted 7, 8, maybe 9 years. So while that was a good idea, a lot of roads were built, that idea didn't last too long. Pipes for water. You still hear about this occasionally in the big cities, where they dig up old pipes that have been in the ground for 100 or more years and discover they're made of wood. And they're bringing water to the homes, which surprises a lot of people. One of the unique things about wood that people say, why didn't it rot? It's wet, carrying water, it's in the ground. But wood is unique in that it does not rot or decay if it's kept wet, dry, or if it doesn't have oxygen. So if it's in the ground, it doesn't have any of those things. The fourth thing it needs the decay needs is you might call it food of the wood. So the four things are important. If you take any one of them away, decay doesn't occur. And if you look at some of these old log cabins that exist, and incidentally, most of the log cabins that I have seen in this part of the world, the logs are made of chestnut, which is why they have lasted so long. And any time I've seen a split rail fence, the rails are made of chestnut. Chestnut was a very, very resistant wood to decay. Sometimes you'll see maybe the lower log is decayed or something, but the upper log's been there 100 years and they're just fine. So that's just one of the unique things about wood. Keep it wet or keep it dry. There's no decay. Bridges, of course. Covered bridges, people think, well, that's nice. They put a cover on the bridge so when I go through the bridge I don't get rained on. The cover was put on to keep the wood dry, to preserve it. And it was done for the longevity of the bridge, not for the benefit of the person going across the bridge. Tunnels, of course. Tanners was very big for leather. Used to be there's a tannery about every 50 miles from any town or any place in eastern United States. And the tanneries got their materials from wood to do the tanning. Naval stores is one we don't think about because naval stores used to be a very big industry, but it's a lost industry. Naval stores was the tapping of pine trees to get the sap. And from the sap they made rosin, they made pitch, and they made a lot of things very important, especially in shipbuilding, wooden shipbuilding. And that's why they're called naval stores. We don't think of that today because we get those materials now from other sources, mainly from the pulp and paper industry. But if we look somewhere, there's a cursor on here that seems to want to continually disappear. This is a shipyard in Savannah, Georgia. This was taken about 1880. And these barrels all contain naval stores. And they're in the process of holding them there till they get enough to load ship cargo to ship them all over the world, mostly back to Europe. But this was a big industry in North Carolina. North Carolina, in the eastern part of the state, was very big in naval stores. And it just from the number of barrels, and I estimated there's something like 3,500 of them there. And they're ready to go, all loaded with the pitch. I think this, computers have a mind of their own. You all know that, I'm sure. This is no... Yeah, right. I'll just hold it there. I'm trying to see the cursor on the screen. Medicines. Sassafras leaves, they were boiled for a tonic. Holly bark, when it was boiled in water and concentrated, it was good for curing a fever. Slippery elm was a great cure for sore throat. Black spruce prevented scurvy. They found out they didn't know it at the time, but black spruce is high in vitamin C. So that was a good tonic for scurvy. Birch sap was just a good general tonic. Butternut bark, butternut tree doesn't seem to be as common as it used to be, but it was a good cathartic, look how to pronounce that. It was believed that it helped cure smallpox in the early 1800s. That was, if you read the history back in that era, that was a big problem, smallpox was, and they believed it cured it. I hope it did. A charcoal believed to settle an upset stomach. And compounds the needles from eastern red cedar. Now they've discovered, and this is a recent discovery, they are good for fighting MRSA. MRSA is that infection you hear about in hospitals, it's so bad. But again, they came back and discovered a forest product is good for controlling MRSA. So the forests are always being looked at as sources. Quinine for malaria. Quinine came from a tree. So there's a whole lot of things that come from the forest. And of course, a lot of these things, when the Europeans arrived on this continent, a lot of these things they picked up from the native populations that had used trees for tonics and as cures and so forth for quite a number of years. Dyes, another one. Brown came from butternut bark, yellow from birch bark. Brown stains came from red oak. And these were used for dyeing cloth, dyeing most anything needed to be dyed. These again were forest products. You have to forgive me, I'm trying to see this and it's kind of far away. I'll just try to hold it steady there. Back in the old days, a lot of people find this surprising. This was the way lumber was cut from a log. It was the thing called a pit saw. You see there's a fellow on top and a fellow below, and between them they had this straight blade that had saw teeth on it. And the man in top pulled it up, and the man at the bottom pulled it down. And all I can say is I'd hate to meet either one of them, because this guy on top has got to have biceps that are huge from lifting that saw all day. It took a lot of time, but back in the 1700s, this is how a board was cut from a log. Now, quite often logs like, for example, I mentioned chestnut could be split easily. With them, they could split the board off. if they could use it in split form. But to get it smooth, this is how it had to be done.
David, I can't see that pit saw. Is it like a buck saw?
Well, the saw itself is just a straight piece of metal. It's
With teeth on it?
with teeth on it,
Okay.
right. The circular saw came along in the late 1700s. The circular saw was invented by a shaker lady. And she came up with the idea of putting the teeth on a circle. But shakers did not get patents. So she's not really credited with it because she didn't get the patent for it, but she was credited with inventing it. A few years later, somebody else saw it and thought about getting a patent and did so. That's how it sort of came into being. The next step, again, I apologize for these being a little plain. They look great on the computer. This is a little faded, but it shows the next step in that. The next step in that was to water power that saw moving up and down. And what it is a wooden frame supporting the saw right there. And it's powered by a water wheel. And now the water wheel moves the saw up and down. The log is put on a carriage, and it's manually transported by the saw. And this could saw a log or saw a board 10 to 15 times faster than two men could with a pit saw. So this was really a big step ahead in processing lumber. And again, it happened like in the late 1700s when water power was really water power, wind power is the only two things we had for power back then. And that's when they did it. And the next operation then would have been the more common sawmill. You can't quite see it, but right here is a circular saw. This is out in the woods, there's nothing but logs. Pull the log over. There's a steam engine over here to power the circular saw. This is all before electricity. And the men would, the saw be running and then move the log by the saw, then push it back, move it forward, and do it again. And it was much better than water power because now you didn't need a stream and a water wheel. The steam engine could be set up anywhere. And then the next step in this, which is kind of where we are today, this is a modern sawmill. This is a huge bandsaw. This is a great big wheel. Another one's underneath the floor. And right there is a band of metal, which is a saw. And this kind of does what the circular saw did and the pit saw. They took the blade of the pit saw, put it in a continuous band. And now it's turned by a water wheel and it's continuous. And the logs are put on this mechanism. It's called a carriage. It's rolled on and it's taken by the saw and pulled back, and they just repeat that as they cut the lumber. And that is this old picture, but it is how a lot of sawmills look today, using the bandsaw.
That's steam powered.
Well, electric power came into industry at about the turn of the last century. Electric motors started coming in. There was water power pretty much up to that point. By 1925, in industry, most machines were powered by their own electric motor. So you have to go back. This particular one, the one before I mentioned, is run by steam. This, as were the factories. About the turn of the century, that's when electricity started coming in and became available. So this machine would be run by electric, as most of them, of course, are today. But that was a big revolution in our industry, to have electricity come in. I mean, you think about it, that was a huge change. As a factory back then, what they generally had, say in the later 1800s, there was a steam engine providing power to a great big shaft that ran the length of the factory. And along that shaft were pulleys, and belts were put on the pulleys down to whatever the machine happened to be it a saw or a shaper or a bandsaw or whatever. And that's how machinery was powered in the latter part of the 1800s and the very early part of the 1900s. That's the difference. That's kind of the magic time it all occurred. Well, I mentioned planes, trains, and automobiles. Of course, this is a very important thing. This is an airplane, which you all recognize, being from North Carolina. The plane that flew at Kitty Hawk was all made of wood, with the exception of the engines. There's one engine with pulleys providing power to two propellers. The engine sat here in the middle. And that was, of course, the first flight. And that airplane is all made of wood, with, of course, a canvas covering on the wings. a more modern plane. This will be about World War II, but you can see still the frame of the wing, the fuselage, the lower wing, the struts are all made of wood. Generally in airplanes, they like to use a species of wood called Sitka Spruce. Sitka Spruce has the advantage, it's an extremely light wood, that pound for pound, Sitka Spruce is stronger than steel. And it's just a unique feature of that particular species, very light. It's also the preferred wood for something like the belly of a guitar. Because it's very lightweight but very stiff, it tends to produce a good tone in the musical instrument. So that's the preferred wood for a lot of stringed instruments. You know, I'll have to tell you, when I look at this all made of wood, these little tiny pieces of wood, I've never quite figured out how they managed to secure the engine. It seems a great big engine up front and a big propeller, you're going to open it up and away it'll go and the plane will sit there, but they didn't. And of course, they were quite successful during the World War II when they were used. Here's another one. This shows better what the wing looked like with all the ribs and so forth, and shows what was the norm at the time, which was a wooden propeller. These are all made by hand. The skill of the propeller maker was very, very important to the performance of the airplane. There is the disadvantage here. You'll notice that the machine gun is right here. Now, for a lot of the time when the World War I started, they discovered the pilots were shooting down their own plane because they'd open up the machine gun trying to get at the enemy and shoot off the tips of the propeller. And that just didn't work very good at all. So anyway, somebody said, we've got to come up with something better. Well, they learned a lot, needless to say, during that, but somebody in the 1920s, 1919s came up with the idea of a synchronizing way to synchronize the firing of the machine gun with the propeller. And I guess as the pilot, you can think, I hope it works. Now, another interesting thing there about the wood, even in World War II, a lot of pilots preferred wooden propellers. The reason they did is a bullet would go through that propeller and the propeller would remain intact. It wouldn't fly apart. If a bullet went through a metal propeller, the propeller would fly apart and become useless. So planes could come in for a landing and there might be 2 or 3 holes in the propeller if they engaged in aerial combat or whatever in World War II. So they developed a lot of systems of wood, how to make these propellers and make them very durable and make them so they wouldn't fly apart if they got a hole punched in them. So again, a wood product came to the rescue for a long time there. Of course, everybody knows the biggest wood airplane ever built was the so-called Spruce Goose that Howard Hughes built with 8 engines on it. And it was made of wood. And this was made at a time when everybody told him he was crazy. There was enough technology out there to make this plane out of aluminum and other metals. But he was very stuck in his ways and had the money, and he built the airplane. And my understanding is he flew it once. And it took off and flew a couple thousand feet and landed again. That was the extent of it. And it's in a museum now someplace, I believe up in the state of Washington. The Boeing aircraft factory was one of the big ones during World War I. They made a lot of airplanes. But the interesting thing in reading about them, when it came in the late 20s, 26, 27, 28, excuse me, they discovered they had no orders for airplanes because most of their orders were military orders. So in the late 20s, the Boeing company went into the furniture business. And they made furniture for about 2 years in the same factory where they made the wooden airplanes. And I guess they were unsuccessful because I have never talked to anybody that ever found a piece of Boeing furniture. But there is some of it out there somewhere, I'm convinced. But anyway, that's where that ended up. Trains in America, many inventors started steam engines in the 1800s. In the 1820s, 1830s, a lot of people were putting a steam engine on wheels. And most of them were doing it, from what I could read, to see what would happen. And more of them were unsuccessful than were successful. Tracks were often wood back then, and somebody made the discovery if you put a metal strip on top of the wood, it would last longer, and the train would run smoother. They burned fuel, and a cord of wood, which is a stack of wood 4 foot by 4 foot by 8 foot, would run a steam engine about 48 miles. So they had to carry a lot of wood or else have the ability to reload the wood every so often. In the estimated 1869, 19,000 cords of wood were burned in steam locomotives in this country. So it was the wood, the fuel of choice. And of course, obviously, it changed to other things, fossil fuels and so forth. Wood was used for the tracks, ties, cars, stations, bridges, trestles, and water tanks. In other words, virtually everything except the steam engine at that time had to be wood. This is an early one. The thing I found most unique about this is the coaches. They look an awful like stagecoaches. And evidently that was the first idea somebody had, and obviously the engine was not going to go terribly fast, but it was on rails. And evidently it was working because there's smoke coming out of it. So that's all I could really conclude from that. A little bit later, it shows a more, quote, modern steam engine, but notice the big load of wood behind it for fuel. And that was the common way of doing it. Another one I found, which also had a load of wood, I think this had been restored because, excuse me, get him back up there. When I got to looking at it close, I discovered somebody had put a pair of antlers on the front. So I concluded somebody had restored this, and maybe this really wasn't an operating steam engine, but it was pretty and it was all painted up nice colors. At that same time, we had a lot of cars being made of wood. This is an example of a typical boxcar, a typical caboose. Of course, cabooses aren't used anymore. Modern technology has eliminated them, but it is totally made of wood. Of course, the fellow sat there so he could look down the track and watch the train, which is what he was supposed to do. And then convenient, there's a wood stove inside to keep him warm in the wintertime. Tank cars, this is one of the first. It's simply a flatbed car with a tank built very much like a barrel that sat on it. And this one kind of hit home to me because I remember my father telling back in the, well, I won't say when it was, but it was a while back. They used to find these in the railroad track, and he grew up around Pittsburgh. And if they were lucky, it was H.J. Heinz Company shipping a little pickles. And they could get up in the car and snitch pickles and take off before anyone caught them. And that was a common, evidently, summertime sport they had. But this reminded me exactly what he talked about. The next step, of course, was to come a little more modern. This is a vinegar car. It's a wooden tank car, built very much like a big barrel. And it's by this vinegar company. And that's how they transported the vinegar. And here's another one which would be used for shipping something like crude oil. And it's, again, a wooden barrel, a big wooden barrel, sitting on a railroad car. This is the nicer side of railroads. Pullman, which was the big passenger car manufacturer in the early part of the railroad industry, built these cars extremely elaborate. And this one you can't see real good, but there's carved mahogany up here. There are leaded glass skylights in the ceiling, and of course very nice upholstered furniture. And that was, I understand, somewhat typical at that time. Here's a dining car, same thing. Very elaborate with wood columns, chairs, furniture, and so forth. So wood was used exclusively, and I shouldn't say exclusively, extensively for railroad cars at that point in time. Which brings us to the next thing, automobiles. Automobiles were started somewhat by folks making carriages, but this would be a typical, well, this is a Model A. We have wooden wheels, wooden spokes on the wheel. There's another one. Spokes are wood. The floor is wood. The members holding up the roof are wood. There's quite a bit of wood being used in the vehicle. And Henry Ford, which was, of course, a pioneer in automobiles, he didn't like the fact that when you cut up a tree, you took something that was round and made things that were rectangular out of it. And there's a lot of waste, and it bothered him. And he had his own forests in northern Michigan that he cut wood and brought them down to his factories in the Detroit area and so forth. So he asked his brother-in-law, said, can you find something to do with all of this wood that we're wasting? The brother-in-law had an idea, and he said, well, we can make charcoal out of it. And by coincidence, the brother-in-law's name was Kingsford. So if you go to the grocery store today, you buy Kingsford charcoal, and that's how the company got started. Thanks to Henry. This one I like. It's a little more elaborate automobile. It's got, of course, the wood spokes. It's got wood floorboards. It's got wood holding up the ceiling, wood steering wheel. The unique thing about it, each window is framed with wood. You can't quite see that, I realize. It's not only framed with wood, but all the windows in the automobile have beveled glass, which is used today in furniture, but back then it was unique, and that was used in this automobile. This is a 1903 automobile.
Is that a Ford? Is it a Ford?
Rolls Royce.
Rolls Royce, oh, okay.
It just went to auction, and I happened to find it on the internet. It went to auction, of course, in Britain, and that's why it's there, I guess. But the other unique thing, you can't see it again, I realized that there's a footrest here for the passengers in the back. One side of the footrest contained a glass cut decanter and 8 glasses. The other side, it contained a small alcohol stove and teacups and a teapot for making tea. Now, how you did that rolling along the highway back then, I have no idea, but that's what was in the inside of the car for the convenience of the passengers. Here's one that I'm sure a lot of you recognize, Body by Fisher. How many remember that? Most everyone. Well, rather interesting history there. These were phased out, but the Body by Fisher they operated a horse-drawn carriage shop in Ohio, of course, making wood carriages. They came to Detroit in 1904, started the Standard Wagon Works, which of course was also making wood wagons. And they got the idea by 1913 they were now making bodies for automobiles, and they were making 100,000 bodies per year. And they were working for all the major automotive companies in that area. The thing they did was unique. They developed new woodworking machinery that allowed interchangeability of parts from vehicle to vehicle. And this greatly helped their production by having standardization. By 1916, they were making 370,000 bodies per year in 40 places in the Detroit area, and they were making them for 16 different car manufacturers. And they listed them where I read this, and I only recognized about half of them. So a lot of the car manufacturers were gone. But anyway, they began, General Motors bought them out, and they slowly phased out that Fisher body emblem. It had phased out pretty much by 1984. So, didn't want to date anybody, but that was the dates I was given when I read this. Some other people that made, here's one. Who do we think made this wagon? This is an old Western chuck wagon. And read up on this, of course you recognize it. Just the bought back and dropped down, and the cook could prepare dinner and so forth. Maybe if I show you another picture of a product, another wagon they made, you'll get the idea who made it. That's a Studebaker. And Studebaker made the wagon. They were in the wagon business back about 1850. And they then began making automobiles. And another one I like, a wagon we all know that they also made, the Budweiser wagon is a Studebaker wagon. And it's still in use by the company as an advertisement. I found this Studebaker advertising an electric automobile. And it's the turn of the last century, or not long after the turn of the last century, but they were making an electric car back then. And now we're starting to hear about electric cars again. So Studebaker was really ahead of their time. The big thing that was happening in the United States in the 1800s, the population was growing, and they realized that the population was mostly concentrated along the coast area of the United States, the Atlantic coast area of the United States. They knew there was a big land out there, and if they were going to grow, they needed to figure out how to get to that land. They could do it by horse-drawn carts and horses and by foot over the mountains, but the Appalachian Mountains were a major, major problem. So the thought was how to get around it. A canal was proposed across New York that would link the Great Lakes with the Atlantic coast. This, of course, was the Erie Canal. And they got funding for it. It took 7 years to build, started in 1817, completed in 1825. It was 363 miles long. Now, if you can imagine, there weren't these big machines we see today. There was a shovel and a horse and some things you could drag behind the horse, and that was the extent of what you could do to dig a canal. But they did it, and they averaged something like 3 miles per day, and that's why it took 7 years to build it. But when they did it, they linked the Great Lakes. At the same time, it was thought, a lot of thought went in. George Washington had this idea of a Chesapeake and Potomac Canal proposed in 1725. And the thought here was to go up the Potomac River, and they knew there were some gaps in the Appalachian Mountains. They were going to try and connect that with the Allegheny River in southern Pennsylvania. And of course, the Allegheny flows into the Ohio flows into the Mississippi, and so forth. Another good connection. That was proposed once or twice. They attempted to fund it, but were not successful. Same time, always have a mind of their own. The thought was the Cumberland Gap, which everyone here is familiar with, in the western part of this state. The Cumberland Gap was another gap through the mountains. It was a possibility. A lot of discussion, but nothing ever happened to make that one materialize. I skipped one here, I'm not. Okay. The first known furniture factory in the United States was Shaw Furniture in Boston, Massachusetts. Shaw began production in 1793. Now, there's a difference between a local craftsman, which was of course around since the early settlement of the Atlantic coast, but a furniture factory is looked upon as a group of individuals making a product that would be shipped to a distant customer. Not just across town by a horse and cart, but maybe 100 miles to this customer or that customer. At this time, when the furniture factory started, about 90% of the people lived in rural America. Now, there were small towns all over America, and of course there were craftsmen in a lot of these towns that made somewhat crude furniture for the people in that town, but a company that would make furniture and ship at a great distance. The first one of those in the country was Shaw Furniture. Haywood Wakefield started production in Gardner, Massachusetts in 1826, and they had a total of 5,000 employees by 1926, 100 years later. So they had pretty tremendous growth, and they had 7 factories around the United States. Then by 1925, there were about 120 furniture factories in Jamestown. So Jamestown also grew to a big furniture manufacturing location. Now, they had the advantage of floating logs down the lake to Jamestown, making the furniture, and then of course shipping on the Erie Canal to the west coast of the United States. So the key thing, the 3 things needed for furniture are, of course, the raw materials, wood, people, skilled people, which were coming to this country from Europe at this point in time, and transportation to move the product from the factory to the customer. Those 3 things were needed. I remember reading somewhere in 1925, a phone call from Boston, Massachusetts to Wichita, Kansas for 3 minutes cost $11.25. Now, that's the money back then, so you can guess today what that would cost. So even communication was not an easy matter back then. The woods first used, of course, wood, pine, walnut, birch, chestnut, poplar, hickory, ash, and red cedar. These are the main ones used for the furniture. Great Lakes area became a source of large amounts of timber. At one time, the Great Lakes area was providing half the timber to the United States. And Powers and Ball furniture started in Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids was unique in that there was, as you might guess from the name, a very large set of rapids on the Grand River. Logs could be floated down the river to the rapids and no further. So they got the idea in Grand Rapids to start a town, sawmills, cut up the logs and the lumber, and make furniture. Go around the rapids, put it back on the Grand River, and ship it down to Lake Michigan, which of course then was all by water to the big cities that were on Lake Michigan, in Cleveland and Chicago and Milwaukee and so forth. And that's really the big thing they had going for them. Transportation and furniture in North Carolina. A lot of folks had good ideas in North Carolina. One of the first was in 1853. A plank road was constructed from Cape Fear to Winston-Salem. Now, I mentioned before that these plank roads were a good idea, but they didn't last very long. And that was one of the first things that happened. The next big thing that happened, which is a plus here, is a railroad was built in 1884 from the north-south North Carolina line to Lenore. And that was a big thing. Now, a lot of railroads were built at this time, short distances. But the problem, they were narrow gauge or various gauges. There was no standard gauge or width of rails of railroads built in the United States. So people were building them because they thought it was a good idea for the transportation, but you couldn't go from one railroad to the next railroad without unloading all the goods, reloading them, and starting all over again. So it was a good idea. Captain William Snow started a furniture factory making shuttles for the textile industry in 1871 in High Point. And his brother and he, joined by his son, they formed Snow Lumber Company, and they started making wooden spools and tool handles. Again, some diversity coming in. These were going incidentally to the textile mills, which were all along the west coast, east coast at that time. This soon became the High Point Furniture Company, making a variety of wooden products. This was followed not long after in 1881 by White Furniture in Mebane, North Carolina. And White is given the credit of being the first furniture factory in the state of North Carolina. They started in that year. White was acquired by another company, I think it was Hickory Chair, and it was successful up until 1993, when unfortunately they went out of business, but they were the first. Let's get things right here. Why my click-to-add titles are coming up, whatever. Company called Hellion Mark started a furniture factory in Charlotte, 1885. They ceased production, unfortunately, in 1899, so they weren't too successful. And from what I read, an awful lot of folks started furniture companies, not only in North Carolina, but in other states, but they really didn't last terribly long for various reasons that you can imagine. Fire was a big problem back then. We talked about that a little bit. Over 300 furniture plants were started in the state by 1910, and only 100 survived past that date. In other words, 200 of the 300 did not make it for various reasons. Caldwell County. When I got to Caldwell County, I started going through a number of books, a number of pamphlets, and so forth. And anyway, discovered in 1889, Lenore Furniture was organized with J.M. Bernhardt as the president. And that, of course, was when Bernhardt got started. 11 years later, it became the Harper Furniture Company. And about 1900, Tom Broyhill, who was in the lumber sawmill business, he started exchanging lumber for stock in furniture company instead of getting paid for the lumber. And this kind of got him into the furniture business. In 1906, J.M. Bernhardt managed the Caldwell Lumber Company and the Bernhardt Boxen Lumber Company. And I understand the Bernhardt Boxen Lumber Company was located at the site of the present factory here in Lenore today. Tom Broyhill bought out the Moore Furniture Company in 1906, and this kind of popped up in a couple of things. The High Point Furniture Company, which I mentioned being formed in High Point very early in the history, he was sold to him, sold to Ed Broyhill in 1942. So that kind of jumped ahead, but again, it was a very old company. It came then from High Point to Lenore. Now, there's an awful lot of things happened in the furniture industry, and I decided, after trying to sort it out, this is going to be very complicated. It's going to end up being another hour presentation. These are the furniture companies that came to Caldwell County. There's 28 of them, and these have all been here. This Powelltown was the first one. It lasted 2 years, and what they can determine, it was built on the site of the current elementary school out in Lower Creek. That was the site of the first furniture company. It lasted 2 years, and then it came into town, and a lot of folks here I know where a lot of these things came from. A lot of the names I'm sure you recognize, but I got this out of a number of books, and this is a total number of companies I could determine operated at one time or another in Caldwell County. Any questions? Either I got you asleep or confused. Must be asleep.
When are you going to do your 1 hour on furniture?
My wife and I have talked about this a little bit. I decided a way to do that would be a great big chart and have arrows going. It's going to look like a great big organizational chart for a big company like U.S. Steel or something by the time it's all done, because a lot of these companies, it said the big problem they had was, of course, economics, shipping. They found they could make the product, they couldn't really get it to the customers they wanted to back then, or fire. Fire was a big problem. I mentioned before that we didn't really get good electricity in the factories. So when a fellow was running a saw or running a planer or running any machine, every few hours he had to stop, get a shovel up all the sawdust and do something with it. And the sawdust was very flammable. So a lot of these companies, unfortunately, caught fire and burned, or part of them caught fire and burned back in those days. The one company I mentioned that Tom Broyhill bought, they actually had a fire and they moved their production to Lenore, to the Lenore Chair Company, short term, until they could rebuild their plant in High Point, which had suffered a fire damage. So fires were common, and all the literature refers to that fires were a major, major problem. Of course, as things went along, they started getting electricity, they started getting dust collection to get the sawdust out of the factory, and ways to prevent the fires and the dust collection and so forth, and it helped an awful lot. It's still a problem. I mean, you still hear of furniture factories catching fire. That and financial issues. So there's a lot of issues to get furniture going. A lot of the early companies only lasted 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And for various reasons, they were acquired by different people, took a different name, different investors, and so forth. So that's why this chart starts becoming very complicated, and that's why I said that's another topic. So I'll stick to the history. But anyway, I think the point I was making, the point I think you get, that wood was and still is an extremely important material in this country and other countries in the world. We are very, very dependent on it. We don't realize it, but we were, and we still are. Okay? Thank you.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the program this morning. Dave sharing his extensive knowledge of the wood industry with us. I'd like to point out that the displays to my left and to your rear have some locally crafted wood products that we've pulled from some of our galleries, and some of our board members and volunteers have also brought in items from their personal collection to display. And in the permanent galleries upstairs, there are additional wood products made here locally in the county too that might be of interest and informative to you as well. We certainly appreciate everybody coming out this morning. I'd like to also thank all of our volunteers and board members who helped set up the program for this month. They truly are the folks who keep this place running and thriving. And if you don't mind, I'd like to recognize them by a round of applause. Feel free to take time to visit in the museum, and if we can answer any questions, we'll Be happy to do so. Y'all have a good day. Thank you.
All the videos that I do are available on DVD. However, you can watch them free on Facebook, Caldwell County Now and Then. I provide a link that'll link you to YouTube. But the support provided by the sale of DVDs helps pay for this very expensive equipment that I have to have in order to do this. Thank you for your support. Hello, I'm Bill Tate with Caldwell County Now and Then, also in association with our local museum, the Caldwell Heritage Museum. If you appreciate what we do, please make a donation to our museum, the Caldwell Heritage Museum, 112 Vaden Street, Lenoir, North Carolina, 28645. Thank you.